thank you all for joining in, yet one more version of this mysterious sense of connection across distance. And it's very good to gather with you here in the Drew Virtual Chapel, whether you are fellow Druids or not. Now you are virtually. But I take on faith, I really do, that I am not just talking to myself tonight. And that is something that someone in my field increasingly has to worry about. Like, who is listening to theologians these days? Especially if the theologian insists upon such an unfun topic as the apocalypse. But I would actually say that it's rather that the topic has insisted itself upon me. So, apocalypse after all, ? And please never leave out that question mark, is the name of the manuscript that I had more or less finished in the fall. But it had actually nothing to do with COVID-19. A global pandemic was the furthest thing from my mind. It is in the 6th chapter of Revelation that pestilence rides into the text on horseback, on the back of the pale green horse. But though I did a deep dive into the book of Revelation, I had said almost nothing about that horse in my manuscript. Indeed, I had given all 4 horsemen short shrift. I was focused on other creepy resonances between the prophetic text from the 1st century and life on the earth in the 21st. It was the bizarre relevance of the ancient scroll to the mounting spiral of climate change and social injustice that had captured my attention. It's actually a scroll within a scroll. The author of the old scroll, the book of Revelation, is depicting another scroll being opened. And that author, John of Patmos, in the midst of one of his many out-of-body experiences, was frantic. He was weeping to see the scroll opened, and only the strange lamb covered with blood, the blood of his own slaughter, is found worthy to open it. And then there is eerie angelic singing, and the openings, the disclosures begin with the openings of the 7 seals. And you can picture the hard wax seals with which important scrolled up documents were sealed. Consider that the root meaning of apocalypse is opening. Apocalypsis, literally unveiling, revealing. It means not the end of the world or final cataclysm, not the closure of time, but disclosure. And given the history of interpretation of this book, a history of endless end of history deployments, I better reveal first, my reading is alien to the fundamentalist US literalist readings that think John was predicting this and that, down to the time and the place. Prophecy is not literal prediction. It is critical vision of deep historical patterns. But the patterns pertain to real situations. They pertain to different phases of our civilization's history, and differently. And they are communicated not in a language of facts, but in a poetry of images. So, in my book, I insist that John's book is not about closure, but disclosure. And yet these openings are harsh. With each of the first 4 seals breaking, one of the horses breaks into view. But I, in writing my manuscript, had skipped right to the 7th scroll opening of a seal, the 7th seal. And it was the one that had hooked me back into this blood-splattered old scroll within a scroll. As the 7th seal is opened, a half hour of silence, we're told, is held in heaven. That is serious suspensefulness. I mean, in this Drew Chapel, we can, when we're actually spatially there together, we can hardly get away with holding 1 minute of meditative silence. So, breathe. And now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets, I'm quoting, made ready to blow them. So another set of 7 blows open with the 7th seal. And against the meditative foil of the silence, the spooky trumpet septet blasts out the next message, trumpet by trumpet. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were hurled to the earth. And 1/3 of the earth was burned up, and 1/3 of the trees were burned up. It was that last phrase that hurled me into this book project. And that was before this last year's gigantic fires in the Amazon and in Australia. I kept thinking as I began this project a couple of years ago of my teachers, friends, students, and brother in California with season after season of worsening wildfires and always these phone calls, how close, how close. These wildfires, just when we need as many trees as possible to suck excess carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So, how close are we to 1/3 of the trees being burnt? Real close. And then I hear the voice saying, not the voice of John of Patmos, blame the environmentalists for those California fires. They blocked the lumber companies from getting rid of the trees. You know, it gets kind of hard to separate such Trump blasts from the trumpet blasts. But he'd like that. He'd say, what an angel I am. But no, there are quite anti-angelic apocalyptic images that fit him better. But let me not give him any more of the attention he craves. Back to John of Patmos. And then the second angel blew his trumpet. And this did, at a certain moment, blow me out of the water. 1/3 of the sea became blood, 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea died. Is it my fundamentalist projection to see ourselves darkly mirrored, not factually predicted, in that ancient future, with our massive die-offs of fish populations, with starving whales, with the threat of the phytoplankton that produce oxygen, not just for the sea, but for more than half the air that we breathe? And with, as I write, already half of the coral reefs that support life in the sea dead? And what of the dramatic rise in red tides? Not literally blood, but the unusually harmful algae blooms now affecting coastlines, as in Florida, Texas. John's surreal nightmare is no nature documentary. It narrates oceanic catastrophe as different from the biblical flood last time. Now, with the fire next time, yeah, that phrase, James Baldwin's prophetic and indeed apocalyptic meditation on racism, shadowing this very moment. But of course, the non-factuality of these verses is evident. John says something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. I can't help but read into, and I mean read into, eisegesis, not exegesis. It's my colleague Stephen Moore, who is the scholar, the biblical scholar of the apocalypse. I'm just a theologian doing this interpretation. So I read into that strange verse, into John's omen, something he couldn't have imagined, but that I think he read dreamily And my new technical term is dream reading. We dream read John, dream reading his time, and I see in those overheated mountains, the glaciers atop great mountains like the Himalayas melting. And I see great glacier mountains everywhere now, melting into the sea. The warming of our planet's atmosphere by so little, so few degrees, already destroying so much. The third trumpet announces the fall of the star Wormwood into the freshwater rivers and springs, and thus many died from the water because it was made bitter. Wormwood was the name of a poison in the ancient world. In this world, think of the toxicity of water in Flint, Pittsburgh, now Newark, so close to Drew. The toxicity, the wormwood of water depriving largely African-American populations of clean drinking water. Think of what the water and the air pollution inflicted on these working class inner city communities due to the immune system of those persons and their body's ability to fight off plagues like the present one. But this all discloses. It does not close history. I mean John's text, his dream reading, and my dream reading of him, it demands response. Not numb paralysis, not political or supernaturalist passivity. It suggests that a pattern that was already at work in John's time has not been laid to rest. Indeed, it seems to be coming to a head with the fire next time now measured in the lethal few degrees of global warming. Of course, apocalyptic catastrophe always seemed to be coming to a head for just about 2,000 years. And it often was, because the pattern, symbolized as the dragon, the two beasts, and the whore of Babylon, is a pattern of power that John experienced and encoded as the Roman Empire, of specifically top-down political imperialism and of the economic imperialism also of Rome. In my book, I quote the 29 items of John's list to make, which he uses to make concrete the seductive force of the global trade of his time, from gold and spices and olive oil and wine to slaves. I won't list them all out now, but I call on this vision, which is the vision of the whore of Babylon, a vision of the global trade of the Roman Empire. We might call her the porn queen of Babylon. Porne is the term used to symbolize the most degraded kind of sex worker, thus the most vicious satire possible of Roman dignitas. It's an expression of John's encrypted radical critique. It signifies a commodification so greedy, so total, that it commodifies even its own royal body. In my book from a previous millennium, Apocalypse Now and Then, subtitled A Feminist Guide to the End of the World, I did a long feminist critique of this abusive use by John of Patmos of the image of an enslaved female sex worker to symbolize horrific imperial evil. That's still the case. I don't disagree with myself. And because the apocalypse is as influential a text as any text in history, the misogyny has been toxic. But it is just because the text is so influential that in this book, Apocalypse Afterall, ? I am concerned to open up, not to shut down, his ancient warning about the union of political and economic power and about its internal contradictions. You recall perhaps the big scene where the beast strips and eats the whore who's been riding on his back and of course constantly fornicating with him and all the kings of the earth. It's rich apocalyptic pseudo-porn. So you might want to watch out for tensions between nationalist politics and global economics. Indeed, you might want to watch out for how they play out right now in the United States and how the habitability of our Earth habitat is at stake in the midst and in the wake of the coronavirus. In other words, the fourth horse has galloped back in. Pale green, a gruesome, sickly color for a horse, isn't it? Kind of ironic that it appears amidst the beautiful pale green buds and shoots of early spring now, 2020. The irony gets worse. A typo that I'm sure was mine made the title of this present talk into Reflection of the Fourth Horseman. I had meant to write Reflection on the Fourth Horseman. So now by this subtitle, I am forced to speak for him somehow now, as though he is speaking through me. The horseman's name was Death. And it comes over a fourth of the earth, killing with sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the verse, and by the wild animals of the earth. That's how the verse reads. It's an odd assemblage. And I just didn't get it or pay much attention until very recently. Human violence is here joined to vulnerability to inhuman conditions of lack of food, of animal attacks, and of pandemic. So hunger is spreading not just in India's violent version of shutdown, but threatening the urban poor in the United States. And oddly, the coronavirus has brought into view dangerous relations to wild animals. Particularly, it seems, bats, made dangerous by the penetration of urban populations into wildlife habitats. This needs to be put carefully, so not in my words, but in the words of John Vidal, writing for the recent Scientific American, the March edition. Only a decade or two ago, it was widely thought that tropical forests and intact natural environments teeming with exotic wildlife threatened humans by harboring the viruses and pathogens that led to new diseases in humans like Ebola, HIV, and dengue. But a number of researchers today think that it is actually humanity's destruction of biodiversity that creates the conditions for new viruses and diseases like COVID-19 and causes them to arise with profound health and economic impacts in rich and poor countries alike. In fact, a new discipline, planetary health, is emerging that focuses on the increasingly visible connections among the well-being of humans, other living things, and entire ecosystems. And he then quotes a leading ecosystem scientist pointing to rats and bats, which are strongly linked with the direct and indirect spread of zoonotic diseases. Rodents and some bats, he says, thrive when we disrupt natural habitats. They are the most likely to promote transmissions of pathogens. The more we disturb the forests and habitats, the more danger we are in. It's Richard Ostfeld. Well, that sheds light on the fourth horseman, doesn't it? Maybe we can call that one Nature Strikes Back, or nickname him The Material World Retaliates, but it's our matter retaliating because we treat matter like it doesn't matter. So it turns against us. In the apocalypse, the galloping threats represent not the nature of the creation and not God's will for the creatures. The punishing pestilence is an impersonal pushback of the inhuman. Should we just call it nature's vengeance? The eco-pope Francis put it this way recently in an interview. The outbreak offered an opportunity to slow down the rate of production and consumption and to learn to understand and contemplate the natural world. We did not, however, respond to the partial catastrophes, he continues. Who now speaks of the fires in Australia or remembers that 18 months ago a boat could cross the North Pole because the glaciers had all melted? Who now speaks of the floods? The Pope said, I don't know if these that is now the phenomena culminating with the virus, are the revenge of nature, but they are certainly nature's responses, he added. Importantly, not God's responses. The angelic septet open the seals. They do not cause these effects, they reveal them. They disclose the destruction wrought by and of non-human systems as the effect of systemic human evil, particularly now the evil embodied in our systems of production and consumption. But let's back up for a moment to the third horse. I'm quoting, its rider held a pair of scales in his hand, and I heard what seemed to be a voice saying, a quart of wheat for a day's pay and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, but do not damage the olive oil and the wine. Oh dear, I confess to hoarding extra bottles of both. But what is that verse about? In context, it is a sarcastic vocalization of economic injustice. Because how can people live if they can just get a bit of grain for a whole day's work? Well, to hell with them, the voice is saying, but just don't hurt the olive oil and the wine, which appear on the cargo list of the Porn Queen chapter as luxury products of global trade in the ancient world. So the third horseman wreaks the destruction of economic oppression and is clearly not accidentally immediately followed by the fourth, carrying galloping hunger and pestilence. And then soon it is followed by the seventh seal, what 2 millennia later can only be dream read as global warming, as I think you'll see. Bloody red and hot. And the question right now, keeping that, that strange blood red heated up sea with all the dying life in it, the burning toxic earth with 1/3 of the trees envisioned already gone. But now, following the percussive intensity of the galloping of the 4 horses, just hear that percussion and in the background, the angelic choirs and each of the trumpets sounding and the seven members of that horn septet. Yes, and I know that there is a composer listening in here from Germany, which is why I'm emphasizing the sonic dimension of the vision. It's not that climate change has in any direct sense brought on COVID-19, but both seem to be material symptoms of a collective human disease. And go ahead and call it original sin if that fits your tradition. Not that all humans then are deemed equally guilty. There are many fewer perpetrators than there are victims, and the victims suffer the consequences, human and inhuman, disproportionately. We humans are utterly unequal in our culpability, and yet we remain us, humans, trapped together, all together, in the ever more interdependent effects of our inequality. And the earth itself and millions of its species, extinct or on the verge, are among the victimized. The earth is running a fever, and now millions of humans are running a high fever too. There is some chance that the disclosure of a refreshed atmosphere reveals that we really could heal human civilization. There is a chance that the wild drop of oil prices are a sign that we could prevent the catastrophe of 3 or 4 degrees centigrade of warming. And yet at the same time, there is a danger, isn't there, of, in our condition, economic comeback with a vengeance, equal to the 3rd and 4th horsemen. As Justin Moreland, the ecological writer for the Time magazine, writes, there's definitely a desire in some corners, particularly in the US, to use future economic stimulus measures to keep the oil and gas industry humming along, business as usual. We'll work this out and we'll get our energy business back, President Trump said at the White House recently. But as the world continues to warm, bringing inevitable climate destruction, it may be helpful for the people running our recovery to remember the adage, don't do stupid things. When it comes to the decades we've spent ignoring the challenge of climate change, business as usual is, in fact, a stupid thing. Business as usual, thank you, Justin Moreland, will lead us toward ecological collapse and possible ecocide. Very stupid. But the point is not here now with this dream reading to threaten or to promise the end of the world. The end is not the conclusion of the book of Revelation. There is a spiraling sequence of immense collapse, loss, and mourning. An eagle cries with a loud voice as it flies in mid-heaven, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. The woe, oi in Greek, is wail of lament, of grief in the face of collective trauma. But the eagle does not announce the end of the world, nor do the angels, nor does John. There is no single final end. There are endings. And there are worlds, and there are worlds that end. Many worlds of our earth collapse, and indeed many have ended since John wrote. The worst, perhaps, driven by Christian civilization turned Roman Empire. The genocide of the Americas, say 1492. The population of the Americas dropped through the violence and the diseases, the pandemics brought by the Europeans by 90%. 90% of the indigenous population. And soon there was the crushing of the world of millions of Africans stolen from their world and sold into slavery. And then the 20th century Holocaust of millions of Jews. And just thereafter, the beasts of superpower developed the capacity to end all of human life and most of the rest of life in a nuclear holocaust. Still an option, Another one that I chose to ignore in my book. It was the nuclear fear, however, that motivated the great film by Ingmar Bergman, which came out in, I think, 1957. I was in kindergarten. The Seventh Seal. It is a medieval story of the horrific plague that finally takes the knight who's returned disillusioned from the Crusades and takes all of his village, and together they appear in the last scene's dance of death. For Bergman, the figure of the half hour of silence before the seventh seal signified the silence of God. His brooding existentialism spoke for his disillusioned generation. And for many, perhaps most thinking people since. Any thoughtful theology now does always need to take into account the breakdown of meaning, and certainly of religious meaning, as the modern world ages and as the religious structures of comfort and hope collapse. And indeed, there is a profound silence of God throughout the book of Revelation. God is depicted as the double gemstone, two kinds of agate, beryl, a cold, if beautiful, image of the impersonal. And the poignant, bloody lamb remains mute. But as noted, the seventh seal does not sorry, this isn't the silence of God. This is because something just leapt on my screen, but it's letting me bring it back. So just take a moment. It won't be a half an hour of silence. This is the first time I've done a lecture in this format, in this way.
No problem. We have lots of patience all the way around. I think all of us have probably run into this at one point or another. So,
thanks. I'm almost there. Yes. So I appreciate the computer system somehow performing my silence a bit, just as we're thinking about God's silence. So yeah, the poignant bloody lamb, the double gemstone. But as I had noted, the seventh seal does not in the text reveal the coming plague. That's not the seventh seal, contrary to Ingmar Bergman's great movie. It's actually the fourth seal. The seventh seal is the overheating, burning, and poisoning of the earth and its waters that is revealed after the silence upon that ultimate seal's opening. And that, I think, says something for us 50 years beyond Bergman's movie, 60 years. The eagle does speak, and it calls us to collective mourning. It's a speak song. And perhaps that is what we are called to now by this plague, and for many of us very intimately. It is not that the world is ending. It is that the world as we have known it may be for a time or for times. And we see our world shifting at a gallop now while we watch time running out, space running out, leaving us nowhere to run. Anna Tsing, who's an anthropologist and the author of The Mushroom at the End of the World, said in a recent interview, "We have created a set of dangerous environments, and we just can't keep imagining that we can exclude them or put them elsewhere. So the big lesson of the virus," she said, "is that there is no place to run." I think she's right. In our expansive and expensive reach across the planet, we have cornered ourselves. But new beginnings have also and all along been real, and new beginnings have also been apocalyptic. The apocalypse ends with the archetype of new beginnings, the New Jerusalem, the urban heart of the new heaven and earth prophesied already 4 centuries before John. That down-to-earth city, it comes down to earth, sparkles with a possibility that we might yet together actualize, no? The possibility of a radically transformed collective earth home with that city's plurisingular tree of the healing of the nations. No supernatural otherworld. No, kings of the nations come in through the gates that are all open 24/7. That's not like the wall we've heard proposed. Not a supernatural otherworld, not a walled up nation, but this many-peopled one, cured of its diseases, pandemic, economic, political, planetary, its waters of life refreshed and free for all who are thirsty, John repeats and repeats. Yeah, that's sparkling there, that utopia. Might we together actualize a few facets of it? But that vision was never about returning to the Garden of Eden. And yet the planetary habitat of our civilization might still be refreshed with new kinds of gardens. The hope that I think you're hearing often articulated in these weeks now is put rather beautifully and straightforwardly by an activist community gardener. She says this: self-isolation is key if we are to stop the pandemic. And yet the need for isolation is in itself an acknowledgement of our deep integration with our surroundings. To fully respond to what's happening, we need to reflect on the worldwide ecological networks that bind us all together. And as the great novelist Arundhati Roy wrote earlier this month, facing into the mass hunger produced by Prime Minister Modi's mode of lockdown in her home country, nonetheless, the pandemic is a portal. Not a portal out of our situation, but into the truth of it. I read this portal in the most properly apocalyptic sense. The pandemic is a disclosure, an unsealing, an unveiling of the darkly luminous truth of us. What most divides us is what most joins us. The relations that bind us for good and for ill can take us down in a connectivity of doom, or they can wrap us in the entanglement that once in a while we might even call love. Words, certainly my words, will not alone motivate the needed change. Our words need to be set in the dissonant music of the cosmic chorusing, the dramatic silence, the spooky horn septet, and the song of the lamenting eagle. Thank you. I'm really glad to be with you in this mysterious way tonight.
Thanks so much, Dr. Keller. Even though some of your audio is off, maybe just a round of applause of thanks to our speaker. Seeing lots of appreciation. We do have a couple questions in the chat. I'm going to say now, I want to give us permission to go 5 to 8 minutes over, so we have at least a good, 10 to 15 minutes for questions here, because we have a few and I don't want to cut us off too quick. So do want to honor your time. If you have to head right at 8 o'clock, we understand, but again, also know we won't go way super duper long. So Dr. Keller, maybe I'll throw you a couple we have here in the chat and you can.
Okay. Can you see me? Because I can't get.
Yep. You're at least.
So I'm fine for this conversation.
Yep.
Okay, good. Never mind. Yes.
So I think first question we have is from Melinda. And I think she's naming kind of some of the beginning is maybe a bit from your talk and then comes a question, but the story of the apocalypse, both in John's quarantine on Patmos and now in this current pandemic, is a story of becoming, not simply a power play of overcoming. Can you say more about what you think it entails for people with privilege and people on the margins to not squander this time of travail, but to disclose and become?
Yeah, beautiful. Melinda, it's so powerful to interpret all of the comings that are announced throughout the book of Revelation. And then finally the coming to all those who are thirsty, and the those all invited to say, come to the Lamb. So it's a reciprocal coming in this down-to-earth moment of that final scene. But it's so important to take all of these comings as expressing a possible becoming. It's not just something coming at us, but it's a coming that we are called into from where we are. And where we are is in a circumstance, unfortunately, not altogether unlike that of John of Patmos, of radical inequality, perhaps in many ways not as extreme as that of the Roman civilization, but sadly so much closer than he would have expected by now, and that all of our experiments in democracy and socialism certainly would have expected. So in that radical inequality in which we find ourselves, it's nonetheless not just the job of those who are most responsible for the inequality and therefore for the systemic destruction of the ecosphere. It's not just up to those who are most responsible for it to fix it, because they're not going to, left to their own devices. It's really for the rest of us, and I include myself, not in those who are most oppressed, but not either in the group of those most responsible. It's up to, let's call us the 99%, to get our voices and our acts together into vast intersectional solidarities of becoming. And that is a coming together. That is an arising, that is a coming up, that is also calling down new possibilities that are still sparkling.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question from David. This one is, do you think Jesus' vision of the kingdom of heaven is of the same reality that John of Patmos describes as the new heaven and the new earth?
I think they're deeply related, and I think they're not the same. And yeah, the apocalypse is not gospel. And there's very little direct language of love in the book of Revelation. I imported it at the very end and delicately just to be faithful to this particular eisegesis. No, I think they're both prophets, whatever else they also may be dubbed. They're both of them, Jesus and John, deeply grounded in the prophetic tradition, and perhaps in a especially deep way that of the second Isaiah and of Ezekiel. But John of Patmos, more Ezekiel, more Daniel. So there's a violence and a ferocity and a binarism that rolls through John's nightmarish visions of destruction that are not characteristic of what Jesus is mostly dream reading. So for the kingdom of God, that you hear over and over in the Gospels also an anticipation of some kind of great collapse, but it's not given anything like the same kind of tragic attention that it gets in John. But in John of Patmos, we're in several decades later, and there had been the horrific massacres of the Jews in Jerusalem during his lifetime, and also of Christians in Rome under Nero, blaming them for the burning of Rome. So he's processing a whole new level of trauma that is after the great hope of the resurrection. And so there's a bitterness in his spirit. And there's the problem of the misogyny, the dualism. I did all of that criticism in my earlier book. And I did a lot of strong distinctions between Jesus and John of Patmos. And I don't think Jesus of Nazareth should ever be confused with John of Patmos. And yet, they're brothers.
Great. We have another question here from Matthew. He says that he finds your concept of homophobia and homophilia compelling and generative. Your earlier work, he finds himself wondering how those might relate to the problems and becomings to which the apocalypse points. Could you comment or speculate on that connection?
Oh, you want me to connect pieces of my own work together? How challenging. No, I love that question. Thank you. These are all great questions. And yeah, so I had written in the face of the deep a whole book basically on the second verse of the Bible, the second verse of Genesis, because it seemed so important to me to bring forth what had been made invisible by the post-biblical doctrine of creation from absolutely nothing, the creatio ex nihilo. I saw there instead what is actually there, the creation over the sort of pre-earth tohu vabohu in a chaotic condition, and darkness over the face of the deep. That's the tehom, and the spirit vibrating or pulsating over the face of the mayim, the sea. And so I wanted to bring that chaotic potentiality into view, out of which and in which the biblical God actually is being seen to create, not from some above, top down over some total emptiness that's somehow outside of God, and creation somehow outside of God, as though there could be outside of that which is the infinite, which has no boundaries. But anyway, I don't want to recite the argument of the face of the deep, but just to say, yes, that chaos of the beginning at least of our world, of the universe that we're in, the universe that perhaps began with the Big Bang, whatever other universes, serial multiverse might have been or might yet be, the beginning of that world in Genesis 1 as a kind of creation out of the deep, out of chaotic conditions, not pure disorder, a more meaningful chaos. That's why I used a lot of chaos theory, fractal theory, to interpret that creation narrative. But my point here, to connect it in response to your question, is that realizing that the beginning is not some absolutely clean beginning point, but is a process of creativity amidst chaos, should give us great courage to go on being creative together amidst whatever chaotic conditions we face, whatever earth in a condition of tohu vabohu, whatever deep darkness we experience. Know that in that darkness and in that deep is also divine calling us into co-creativity, the co-creativity that we were all called into in the beginning. And when I say we all, I don't mean just us humans. We're late in the game when the sixth day called into the co-creativity. In the meantime, the other creatures are called forth, and very explicitly, the earth is asked to bring forth and the seas to bring forth. So it's a vast interactive co-creativity with God, Elohim, not controlling it, but responding to calling it forth, and and absolutely delighting in it. Like, ooh, that's good, that's good, that's good. And then all together, very good. That extreme delight is probably tempered by a lot of disappointment, at least with this particular species and what it's wrought on the earth, what we've done with all of our incredible freedom being part of what is called forth in that creativity, and freedom to create beautiful forms of expansive new structures, order, or to create hideous forms of order that just bring about destructive chaos. So yeah, thinking tehomophobically just boxes us into dependence on a kind of creator from nothing to come back in at the very end and create everything anew from absolutely nothing. And that's the supernatural kind of new creation. And instead, I'm saying, no, this new creation can come to be out of our co-creative efforts, and they must be co-creative with the other creatures, the ones we haven't yet rendered extinct on this earth. And I see there no guarantee. A promise is not the same as a guarantee. A promise in the Bible, as with all the prophetic promises, right, requires covenantal reciprocity. We need to do our part for the promises to be fulfilled. And that leaves us in a chaos with great gifts for co-creativity, even now.
Great. These questions are coming in hot, which is wonderful. I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, so I think let's definitely try to take one or two more, and then I want to honor folks' time tonight and Dr. Keller's time that she's given us.
And I'll stop in response to each question.
Yeah, no, you're great. This question is from Alex. He says, the Earth has experienced multiple mass extinctions of life across its 4 billion year history. As we attempt to move away from an anthropocentrism in our philosophy and theology, how does this idea impact our understanding about the end of the world and the ways that life on planet Earth continues on, just in ways that may not include us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a necessary question, Alex, isn't it? And I think by reflecting biblically even on the creation as something that doesn't have some simple, neat beginning point 6,000 years ago, or 7 days ago, or however you calculate it, those symbolic gates, understanding that there's mysterious ongoingness that didn't have scientific numbers to it in the Bible, but understanding that, yes, we have those billions of years just even on this planet, not even beginning to calculate for our galaxy and for the unthinkably many billions of other galaxies. So yes, the human life that we are emerged, and we're in danger of submerging it into extinction as we have extinguished so many other species. So yes, if that happens, that also will not be the end of the world. It will be the end of the hope for the New Jerusalem. That will be then a failed dream, one that, however, came through with great sparkles at moments of transformation and hope all through our history, and one that perhaps can just shift into another kind of eschatology. And I don't rule it out. I am in solidarity with my old friend Jürgen Moltmann, who holds to a certain way in which we're taken into God upon death, no matter what, and some kind of cosmic community. Yes, perhaps, but that doesn't make it okay from my perspective. This was too important an experiment. So I don't think it's okay for us to go ahead and get extinct. I don't think it's okay for anything that vaguely resembles what we call God, even if that God is nothing like a human being or a person and all the other anthropomorphic projections. Nonetheless, I suspect we're a pretty interesting contribution to the creative project of the universe. And, if it's true that God is not unmoved, but somehow moved with us, not just the stone, but also the lamb, yeah, it would be painful to God if we were lost. But then there are probably lots, maybe hundreds, maybe billions of other species more intelligent and perhaps more wise than we are elsewhere. And who knows what can emerge again on this earth. So yeah, if we go extinct, it isn't the end of the world, just the end of all of the hopes that constitute the best of our history.
Great. Well, I want to officially apologize. I'm going to go ahead and include one more question, and there are more than that, but I don't think we have time to get through every single one. So I'm sure Dr. Keller would love to hear from you, whether that's at a future event she's speaking at or in other.
And I got those chats, and I'll try to do some little email responses, perhaps.
Great, great. Yeah, no, we can save. We have these saved here, and we have names too. So maybe we'll share those with you, and you can reach out to those folks. But I did want to go out of order a little bit and actually offer you one of our last questions from someone named Nisha. And I think partially that's because we're all coming to this conversation for different reasons. Some of us are coming with a focus on maybe doing research work in religious studies or theology and philosophy, and others of us may be in very practical vocational ministerial settings. Some of us may be both, like myself. And so the question here is, where do we need to locate the church, her presence and doing in the midst of apocalyptic upheaval? And if I can, I may even ask a little bit of my own question that seems to resonate with that, which is in your first apocalypse book, you delineate a bit between anti-apocalypse and counter-apocalypse. And for some of us that maybe are hearing your talk with the resonance of coming from some of those evangelical fundamentalist spaces where toxic apocalyptic theology defined our former life, maybe some of our current life, maybe some of our own therapy sessions. I'm wondering, it's easy to have that impulse of anti-apocalypse that resonates really deeply in kind of an escape from that kind of theological worldview. So I I'm wondering this, where do you look at the church and what you're talking about? And also maybe how do you distinguish between anti and counter apocalypse?
Yeah, well, those are related. I mean, part of the reason I didn't want to join folk like my friend Lee Quimby, who wrote a book called Anti-Apocalypse, a very smart feminist literary systematic denunciation of the Book of Revelation and all of its misogyny. And I totally get that, and I share a lot of that perspective, and yet, I didn't want to go there. In part, at that time when I started on this, I started actually thinking about it in the late 80s because I was afraid of nuclear holocaust at that time, had those kind of nightmares. By the time I was really writing the book, that seemed a little more in the past. But yeah, I wanted to write with the church and for the church, and not against it by being against, the last text of the Second Testament, the last scroll of the big scroll of the Bible. And I wanted to find my way in there, and I did partly because I had realized that a lot of the criticism of the Book of Revelation is just riveted on the fundamentalist readings of the Book of Revelation, and it misses that all of the revolutions for democracy, for egalitarianism, for socialism, even for communism in the Western world, all of those revolutions have been shown to derive very directly from the apocalyptic lineage. I go way into those sources if you want them in the first book, and Ernst Bloch especially. So I realized it's a source for the progressive movements for transformation. So I thought, if we're going to work as progressive Christians, and that's how I understood and understand myself still, then we want language that can work with the resources of the church. And I think I'm doing that even more now. The counter-apocalypse was the alternative to the anti-apocalypse. And I'm doing a form of counter-apocalypse still, just not stressing it because it can be misheard. People mistake it for anti. But I meant by counter-apocalypse, we're not opposed to the whole book of Revelation. We are countering the destructive aspects of it. But we are doing our own kind of apocalypse, participating in it. That seemed more honest. And now I'm, by doing this book, oddly, working even more closely with churches, hoping to give them more ammunition, more swords in the book of Revelation sense, angelic swords that are nonviolent, of course, for resisting the fundamentalist readings and for helping to free people within our congregations from those self-righteous, dualistic, end of the world sort of literalist readings that always have to be recalibrated because all of their literal predictions always turn out to be historically wrong. Start over, but it always goes on working. So this is to give folk in churches resources. At the same time, the reason it's strange is that I also have written this book hoping it would be accessible to people who are not religious in any way or who belong to other religions. So I haven't written it just for we Christians. So I, as a Christian theologian, have written this book hoping that it would call forth some solidarity with folk of other religious backgrounds and traditions being alive, and for folk who are spiritual, not religious, or even who are atheists in an ethical way, but interested in broad coalitions of solidarity. So I'm hoping it works with the church. And just to end, again, I'm wanting to say too much, but one thing I go into a lot in my chapter 7, which is of course the New Jerusalem chapter, is how the vision focuses on there being no temple, no sanctuary within the New Jerusalem. Why? because God indwells the whole city. So the whole city is immanent to this now fully immanent God. It doesn't mean God ceases also to transcend in the sense of being beyond what we can know. But God is depicted here as having come down to earth and indwelling that city which dwells in God. So there are no separate religious institutions. Does that mean really, from John's vision, there shouldn't be any churches? No. But it means that churches shouldn't understand themselves as, as separate in their holiness from all that is around them. It means they are sites within a space of renewal in which all are invited. The gates kept open 24/7. I think this is where the churches that I'm proud to be engaged with, my little not so tiny church, St. Paul and St. Andrew United Methodist in Manhattan, practices this to a T. Gates always open. Right now, the whole sanctuary filled with boxes of food for the hungry of Manhattan during this plague and helping with the city in that work. So a lot of churches are not just little separations of themselves from the rest of the world, but are places of New Jerusalem.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Keller. Everyone, we want to just give our gratitude for you spending your time with us this evening, and to all of you who joined to participate in this conversation. These were some fabulous questions, I think, at least I can say from my perspective.
Really beautiful questions, and I'll try to get to the other ones.
Yep. No, we'll share those with you. And if anyone didn't get their question in, you should have received the link from me, Scott Oslin, from my email address. So any questions you have, you can also send my way, and I can always pass them on to Dr. Keller as well if you need to figure out your answer to questions about the kingdom of heaven or John of Patmos or anything along those lines. I will say, before we get heading out, just a couple announcements. I do want to remind you, we're going to have another talk in this series coming up. That's going to be with Dr. Jennifer Quigley, communicating across distance, lessons for quarantine from the letters of Paul. That's our next event, so I really encourage you to register. That's on May 7th. And then also, for anyone who is here, I know a number of you are either in the application process to Drew or are interested in programs or classes at Drew, might want to study more of this apocalyptic theology work with Dr. Keller in person. Kevin Miller, Reverend Dr. Kevin Miller, has been on the call today and is our director of admissions at the theological school. And his email is in the chat there, but he's a great person to reach out to if you have questions about how to apply for this fall, or just have questions about a future term that you may want to join us for a class or for a program. So I encourage you to reach out to Kevin or to any of us. I'll put my email in there as well. I'm going to be kind of facilitating these events as they go. So if you have any questions about how to register for future ones, or just anything related to how we're kind of keeping Drew out there in the internet while we wait to be back together in person, feel free to reach out to me. But we're so grateful that you were all with us. And again, Dr. Keller, thanks for spending some time this evening.
And thank you, Scott, for this amazing work that you're doing. You're an important leader for getting us through this time.
We're all doing our part. But great to be with you all. Take care. Stay safe and healthy. Our blessings and prayers are with you, those of us that are praying people. Take care of yourself.